Welcome to the 72nd episode of the interview series, a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based nonprofit organization that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. I'm Jon Riccio, joined today by Tory Huff, a poet and professor of English living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His work has been published in Narrative Magazine, Nashville Review, Cimarron Review, and Fairytale Review. He holds an MFA in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop and is currently working on his first book of poems. Greetings, Tory.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's begin with your poem appearing in the silver issue of Fairytale Review. At the peak of Peace Mountain, you have had a hard time, since it's tailor-made for launching into your work and how it envisions the current leg of this marathon we call surrealism.
Sweet. At the peak of Peace Mountain, you have had a hard time. So long to gentleness and limish imagination. So long to tomorrow's chuck roast and optimism. So long to the children and their children's palm-sized loafers. So long to the aromatic plethora, that snack cake temptress, but not to cruelty, the heart's little guard dog. His collar is fish scales, his tail a volcanic metronome, eruptive and respectful of time, motherly and eating from nature's palm. To be a good mother is to accept the apocalypse. To be a good apocalypse is to accept your mother. Accept her the way the soil accepts the rodent, begrudgingly and without composure. And the world shouts again. So long to the birthday party and to the trumpeter's trip to Paris. So long to the plump case of berries, the commander's sweater, the smell of knowing the answer. And so long most of all to the ballet. In fact, so long forever to the ballet. To be a good ballet is to be so long forever. To be a good forever is to have an hourglass figure. To be a good rodent is to face the mountain with your back turned.
I love the juxtaposition of chuck roast and a snack cake temptress, as well as fish scale collars and palm-sized loafers. And even when I was just saying the title, the scansion person in me was thinking, okay, we've got all of these one syllable words, then we have mountain. But if you just hear the rhythm of it, since we have that metronomic aspect of the poem, at the peak of Peace Mountain, you've got those long E's, and then you have had a hard time, that H alliteration. I also enjoy how you aligned those anaphras, so long to and to be a good. You aligned them with a columnar structure, concretion and enigma intermingling in the plump case of berries, the commander's sweater, the smell of knowing the answer. What draws you to surrealism? And as one of the movement's contemporary practitioner stewards, where would you like to take it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are different readers for or different answers for surrealism from a reader approach and from a writer's approach. I think from the approach of a reader and reading surrealism, I'm really interested in sort of the idea of like having emotional responses to things that we don't understand, and the ways that we can read surrealism without really coming away with any clear interpretation and still have had some sort of emotional response. You read a poem that's a little bit more literal, maybe like it's a poem about grief, and you have an emotional response, but you know that that emotional response is sort of in relation to your own experience and understanding of grief. But if you read a surreal poem or a surreal story, you maybe don't have that reference of necessarily why you're having any sort of intellectual or emotional reaction. And I think just knowing that we're able to react to things that we don't understand says a lot about us, in a way that reacting to things that are, I don't know, maybe more literally accessible doesn't necessarily do.
Mhm.
And I also think from a writing perspective, writing surreal poetry for me feels more surprising to myself and also I think more authentic. Um, when you're writing something literal, you have to be maybe a bit more intentional and forward thinking about where you're going in a poem. Whereas I think personally, when I'm writing something that's more surreal, I feel able to just let the poem take me where it's going. I think the moment when I think of an image and the moment when I write that image down almost happens simultaneously in a way that it doesn't necessarily do if I'm writing something more literal.
Mhm.
And so I get to be surprised by the things that I'm writing as I'm writing them. And it also feels more authentic to me as a person.
Mhm.
Um, I think in my personal life, I am someone who often struggles to articulate what I'm thinking and feeling in a way that feels accurate. And I think that's true with poetry as well. But with poetry, you have the luxury of sort of expressing your feelings in these sort of surreal images that you can't necessarily do that in your day-to-day conversations, right? I can't just start spitting out these like nonsensical images to represent how I'm feeling. I
Mhm.
actually have to like struggle and like find the words to accurately represent what I'm trying to say. Whereas in poetry, I can sort of let the images and that sort of nonsensical nonlinear thinking do that job for me, I think.
Mhm. There's a line that I just wrote out this afternoon, having read it during the pandemic. Aimé César has a collection, Soleil Coupé, which translates to solar throat slashed. And I've always, it's always in the head. And I actually remember writing it on a note card and just taping it to my apartment wall. In the time it took for the tornado to write a detective novel, and in the normal world, tornadoes don't go around writing detective novels, at least not that I'm aware. Maybe in Oklahoma, which we'll get to in a bit, but even not the ones in Mississippi, but just the fact that you have a tornado aspiring to be the next Agatha Christie. And to me, that just rocks all the foundations that I need as a surrealist. And it gives me a new kind of ground to stand on, and it changes the firmament of that ground. And that's one of those I always try to pass that on to students. Just when you think you can't get impossible enough, here's an example. Let's hear your second fairy tale review poem, Cockroach Angel.
Cockroach Angel. The miracle has two arms, one to hold big pleasure and one to hold big luck. He presses them together to kiss, dolls embracing for a future entirely electric and lactose free. Maybe dairy is not such a humongous sacrifice for the sake of passion. If the body's job is to experience for a living, it must give up some pleasant dangers, like cheese or the internet or reading the baby fan fiction. 1498, Da Vinci paints The Last Supper, the world's first mukbang. Every history, even history, has a history of gluttony, art as an exercise in indulgence, indulgence as an exercise in being in love. Da Vinci did not know the minister of nutrition and thus lived without vitamins. Just brush and canvas and a calling to paint Christian fraternity. When the paint runs dry, there will be only crumbs and insects to devour them. I will be an insect, and so will you. Thoraxes full of crude understanding. Wings meant for a purpose, and no one to remember what that purpose is. The miracle brings a cake, and that is our introduction to God. God by the slice, heaven tiered and frosted.
The only thing better than a two-armed miracle is, of course, a Da Vincian mukbang, topped off with a history of gluttony. Your title, I'm going to say it again, it's so rich. Cockroach Angel takes me down a Kafkaesque path. It also reminds me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. Marquez's angel, who's dressed like a rag picker, performs consolation miracles, which were more like mocking fun. He's usurped by a woman who had been changed into a spider for having disobeyed her parents. The admission to see her was not only less than the admission to see the angel, but people were permitted to ask her all manner of questions about her absurd state and to examine her up and down so that no one would ever doubt the truth of her horror. She was a frightful tarantula the size of a ram and with the head of a sad maiden. What was most heart-rending, however, was not her outlandish shape, but the sincere affliction with which she recounted the details of her misfortune. While still practically a child, she had sneaked out of her parents' house to go to a dance, and while she was coming back through the woods after having danced all night without permission, a fearful thunderclap rent the sky in two, and through the crack came the lightning bolt of brimstone that changed her into a spider. Her only nourishment came from the meatballs that charitable souls chose to toss into her mouth. A spectacle like that, full of so much human truth and with such a fearful lesson, was bound to defeat without even trying that of a haughty angel who scarcely deigned to look at mortals. Now, this phrase from the middle of your poem, art as an exercise in indulgence, indulgence as an exercise in being in love, pivots me back to Kafka. These lines painting the opposite of what his main character in A Hunger Artist experiences as a professional faster, the longest period fixed by his impresario at 40 days. Unfortunately, the public's fickleness reduces him to a circus exhibit, as seen in this passage. The hunger artist averred that he could fast as well as ever, which was entirely credible. He even alleged that if he were allowed to fast as he liked, and this was at once promised him without more ado, he could astound the world by establishing a record never yet achieved, a statement that certainly provoked a smile among the other professionals, since it left out of account the change in public opinion, which the hunger artist in his zeal conveniently forgot. He had not, however, actually lost his sense of the real situation and took it as a matter of course that he and his cage should be stationed not in the middle of the ring as a main attraction, but outside near the animal cages on a site that was, after all, easily accessible. Large and gaily painted placards made a frame for the cage and announced what was to be seen inside it. When the public came thronging out in the intervals to see the animals, they could hardly avoid passing the hunger artist's cage and stopping there for a moment. Perhaps they might even have stayed longer had not those pressing behind them in the narrow gangway, who did not understand why they should be held up on their way towards the excitements of the menagerie, made it impossible for anyone to stand gazing for any length of time. And that was the reason why the hunger artist, who had, of course, been looking forward to these visiting hours as the main achievement of his life, began instead to shrink from them. At first, he could hardly wait for the intervals. It was exhilarating to watch the crowds come streaming his way until only too soon. Not even the most obstinate self-deception clung to almost consciously could hold out against the fact the conviction was borne in upon him that these people, most of them, to judge from their actions again and again, without exception, were all on their way to the menagerie. Just like the wings in Cockroach Angel, Kafka's hunger artist was meant for a purpose and no one to remember what that purpose is. How did this poem come together for you, crudely understanding thoraxes and all?
Yeah, I think one thing that I really enjoy doing that brings me, I feel like, a lot of pleasure in writing is thinking about how we can connect more classic or historical ideas or moments with more contemporary ideas. And so this poem, the first part of this poem that was ever written was that line about the Last Supper being the world's first mukbang. I think I wrote that line. I think that line was in the very first poem I ever had workshopped in grad school, which was a while ago. And that poem I think was, discarded maybe immediately after that workshop. But that line, I really liked it. And so I hung on to it, just sort of like trying to fit it in any poem that I could. Um, and I started going through this phase maybe last year where I was being invited to a lot of weddings. My friends were getting married. And every time you RSVP, they're asking, do you have any dietary restrictions? And so I was really thinking of this idea of dietary restrictions. And my partner's lactose free. And so just thinking about this idea of like life's greatest pleasures that we sometimes, have to give up, giving up cheese, giving up milk. And so I started writing this poem about that. And it struck me that I had this line that was related to sort of not necessarily restrictions, but maybe the exact opposite of complete like obliteration of inhibition in the idea of this mukbang. And so thinking about, just the differences between restricting ourselves or finding excuses to get rid of all restrictions. And in my head, a mukbang is sort of like an artistic excuse to ignore those sort of like internal boundaries that we've created. It happens all the time. I'm eating something that's just like so good, my favorite food, and I eventually have to stop myself for like future preservation, right? To keep myself from regretting it later. And thinking of a mukbang almost as an excuse to ignore that sort of warning. And so, yeah, and from there, I just went and I was thinking, what are other excuses that we give ourselves to sort of indulge in our base instincts? I think love is one of those, right? When we start to fall in love, we sort of use that as an excuse to like completely devote ourselves or obsess over this person or this feeling. And that's kind of where the poem went from there. I also really sort of wanted to set up this idea of the ways in which indulgence or obsession sort of devolves us into almost like lesser beings. You think when you overeat, we sort of like equate ourselves to being pig-like. When we're like so head over heels in love, we sort of equate that with being somewhat like a puppy dog. Um, and so starting the poem with this stanza about like a miracle controlling these dolls in sort of like a godlike way. And then the next stanza, the subject sort of devolves to man being represented by Da Vinci or the Minister of Nutrition. And then from there being devolved once again to insects. And so the way that, sort of obsession or giving ourselves over to indulgence almost like takes us to our base instinct to these like lowly creatures. And I think that's the path that I was trying to follow with this poem.
Mhm. Now I'm thinking about the kind of mukbangs I've had with food, and I guess you could call me a ketchup addict. And my excuse is because it has lycopene in it, and we all know that lycopene is good for our health. But I have been known to drain a complete bottle of ketchup, and particularly at restaurants. I mean, you're getting charged anyway, so just add the ketchup in there, but don't pay for it, and I will drain it. Also, I have been on an olive oil kick because, again, the health benefits, the antioxidants,
Absolutely.
but sometimes, and I guess many a times, we poets love that word dollop, but I'm beyond the dollop phase. It's more like
A
one
dollop's not enough.
teaspoon.
Yeah.
No, no, no. The teaspoon's not good enough. Let's get the tablespoon. Then let's get the tablespoon that is slightly on its way to being a spatula, but it's for health reasons. And this chicken needs the olive oil, and this, yes, even tofu and olive oil. The only caveat I will give with that, tofu has watery consistency, and a lot of it reduces. And you, if you want to have the tofu overindulgence with the olive oil overindulgence, you just need to have a good draining mechanism. So just drain that out into the sink, the little soupy, watery olive oil-ishness of it, and then you've got yourself a good mukbang of a dinner.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocator for a sauce. I think most foods, I'm a firm believer, need some sort of sauce. I also love ketchup.
Hmm.
I get through bottles weekly, probably.
I mean, and another good example of how sauce can help wean you off of another food that might not be the best. And I tell my students this because there is a monologue we read It's called French Fries, and it's written by Jane Martin, but in most likelihood, it's a playwright named or director slash playwright named John Jory who's masquerading as Jane. But I will tell them about the phase when I had a chicken McNugget addiction, and it's not the healthiest thing you can do to be putting all of those process. It's the process of the process of the process that is going into you. And what I will share, and I guess I'm now sharing it with the wide world of 1 week critique. If you ever have to wean yourself off of a McNugget addiction, you take a bagel, you toast it to the consistency of the crunch that you get from McNugget. You get it right out of the toaster. You plunge it into barbecue sauce, and the barbecue sauce combined with the heat of the bagel, combined with the crispy texture, is about 75% of the way on to mimicking a McNugget. And if you just use the other 25% of your brain to say, this is healthier in the long run, I will not be going to McDonald's tonight to get that 6 piece, 9 piece. Maybe they have a dozen piece now, but you wean yourself off of the McNuggets. You feel a little bit better about yourself. And
And
that's
then
my going
like,
wisdom. Jon Riccio, addiction therapist to the McNuggets, entranced and enhanced.
no, that makes me think of this collection of poems, Letters to Wendy's. Um, and I can't remember the author. It's been so long since I've read it. But just like sort of this collection of love letters to the fast food chain Wendy's. And there's certainly like stand-ins for other feelings as well. But just thinking of like these sort of extremely accessible places that we're all familiar with and the way that so many people have these relationships with these places, but I don't know. It feels personal, right? Like it feels like your chicken McNugget addiction is like, oh, it's this thing that I'm afflicted with, and no one else is eating chicken nuggets the way that I am, but we all feel it.
And there's also a universality. And I guess one of my teaching tricks, and we technically we're recording this on March 28th, so we probably have maybe 1 or 2 more days of actually being able to use this in the classroom, but to forge connections with students, most everyone on the planet, and I don't know what this says about the shape of the world, but if you drop a Shamrock Shake reference, particularly in the month of March, you will command attention. You might even command some respect. But the clock is ticking. Soon it's going to be April, and those Shamrock Shakes, they just go away for 11 months. They go into hibernation. They go to
Forgotten for a year.
McDonald's sleepaway camp, and then after February 28th or the 29th, if it's that time of the calendar to do leap year, they have that reign of dairy immortality that lasts all of 31 days. And we love it. And then I guess I could mention the McLean Deluxe, but not many people know about that. That was a long ago McDonald's trying to be healthier. Just Google it. If you've never heard of the McLean Deluxe, all of you Google it. Whereas Cockroach Angel is a decree of lactose free. Your prose poem, The Quaker Oats Quaker Gets Very Sad, shows its dairy love. Could we hear this one too?
Yeah, absolutely. The Quaker Oats Quaker gets very sad. Despite his more careerist decisions, the Quaker Oats Quaker does not like oatmeal. He despises most hot breakfasts. The Quaker Oats Quaker is a yogurt man. He loves a Chobani flip, which he consumes like a goat. I am a dairy vampire, he says to his therapist, and she ends their session early. As he walks down the street, the Quaker Oats Quaker sees a sign in a shop window that says 10-cent DVDs. Never in my friendly existence has a dime held so much value, he says to himself and goes in. The DVDs are in a milk crate that smells of unfinished basement. He selects Because of Winn-Dixie, and the cashier says to him, "You sure? That movie is very sad." Sometimes, the Quaker Oats Quaker responds, a yogurt is best enjoyed when one is very sad. He returns home, plays his newly purchased film, and begins to fill himself with yogurt. The film makes him very sad, and he says to himself, sometimes it is difficult to be a Christian in advertising. He takes another spoonful, and sometimes, he continues, a cold breakfast does not make me feel any better. He lies down on his sofa, feeling too full to move. I am a dairy vampire, he exclaims. A yogurt-filled donut, a corpse embalmed with fermented milk. He notices a drop of yogurt on his blue coat. It holds its form like a cloud, and it's shaped like a jellyfish, or maybe a loaf of bread.
Here we have brand logos meeting the pathos of discount bins. Pantry iconography is what I would file your poem under, followed by a reevaluation of my relationship with hot breakfasts. I love the word porridge, and I have practically mythologized the steel cutting process of oats. Yet, and I'm laying my appliance cards on the table. I've already put my chicken McNugget addiction cards on the table, so pretty much everything is fair game at this point. But I have a thing about microwaves. They give me the willies. Short of a stovetop, forget it. The article, Is McDonald's a Religion, at bartleby.com states the public consumes an abundance of products that unifies us to all be a culture. With that being said, certain commodities can become very popular and prominent in our society. Therefore, a possibility of this being translated into the production of a new religion. This gels with a Quaker's image for selling oats. Additionally, it resonates with your sentence, sometimes it is difficult to be a Christian in advertising. I also remember that Cockroach Angel touches on the Last Supper and Christian fraternity. In what other ways do food and faith factor into your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in the same way that I really like to play around with sort of the dynamic between modern ideas and sort of historical or classic ideas, I also really love to toy with sort of the juxtaposition of serious topics with more unserious language. And I don't know that there are any more serious topics than religion. It feels to me as serious as it gets. And um, it was also just such a big part of how I was raised, growing up in Oklahoma. It's hard not to be raised in an extremely Christian household. And thinking about the relationship between religion and food, especially in like a southern state, they go so hand in hand. It's hard to have any sort of um, Christian social event without there being food. The idea of a potluck to me is so synonymous with like church services or church events, even though they exist everywhere. It's like every time I'm invited to a potluck now in my life, it's like, oh, am I going to church? No, this is just like a social activity that has nothing to do with that. But they're so connected in my brain. Um, I mean, even in Christianity itself, it's like such a food-based religion, right? There are so many parables related to food, so many metaphors of like the body of Christ being bread, the blood of Christ being wine, multiplying loaves and fishes and fruit that you're not supposed to eat. There's so much to do with food, and I just think food to me is such like an unserious topic, right? It can be so silly sometimes in the way that we approach food, the way that food is named. I think especially in sort of like modern marketing brands, it's like they're the silliest names. Chobani Flip, like what do those words mean? Who knows? But using those two ideas to sort of explore each other or to relate to each other, I think is something that brings me a lot of excitement in writing. Using like unserious topics to explore more serious topics. And yeah, I think there's like so much commonality between how we treat religion and how we treat food. And that feels, a little blasphemous to say, but
Mhm.
food is like a religion, right? Going back to fast food chains, it's maybe a religion that we're all a part, not everyone. Those of us lucky enough to not be drawn in are excluded, but it's a religion that we're all a part of without really entering intentionally. It just draws us in. And so, yeah, I think exploring those ideas is something that I really enjoy doing.
Mhm. I think it's also interesting how what might be considered a weapon outside of the kitchen becomes a transformative artist tool. And I'm thinking especially about creme brulee and the little torch that is needed for it.
Right.
Or in Catholicism, Easter, we have those Lenten Fridays, the fish fries. And the best part, post Easter Mass would usually be coming home, and there would be, if you went to grandma's house, a cake mold that was in the shape of a lamb, and it was white frosted, and coconut represented the lamb's wool. And also, as a little boy, for some reason, I associated tapioca, the taste of it, with what I would imagine lamb's wool would taste like. And I always called tapioca lamb's wool. And even after church, there's donut services, coffee services, and they just go hand in hand. This is as good a segue as any for discussing your poem, Letters to God, after seeing a sign for the National Shrine of the Infant Jesus of Prague in Prague, Oklahoma. I drove through your home states on my way to Arizona in 2013. And what I most recall, speaking of food, it's the toll booths. They had these collection buckets shaped, I kid you not, like diner baskets that serve fish and chips. And I had so much fun throwing my change into them as if it were a summerfied version of March Madness. And see, it doesn't take much to spark my imagination. Oklahoma became my metaphysical NCAA stretch before the Amarillo Hotel. There's a point where your poem's eye, as a first grader no less, writes, God of big, big candy bars in a composition book, not to be confused with Mark Wunderlich's 2021 collection, God of Nothingness, its poem Wunderlich, exploring the meaning of his last name in such lines as, the name means strange things happen to him. It means he can be disputatious. It means he sometimes wears peculiar garments to a party, that as he aged, he seemed younger, less reliable, more in touch with what he would call his soul. You might not call it that yourself. It can mean quarrelsome. It can mean he prefers cats. It can mean he has a gnome tattooed near the hair underneath his arm. It's a poem I share with my intro to creative writing students before prompting them to ponder their name's evocations. For the record, Riccio means hedgehog or curly hair, so I lucked out with that one. Now, the fourth section of Letters to God tells us there is something godlike in naming a place, as if by naming it, you are also creating it. A field is just a field until you name it. A building, just a building until you put a baby doll with a little bedazzled crown in the center and call it a shrine, a place worth advertising. What naming conventions play a role in how you title your poems?
Yeah, I think, well, for this poem in particular, I think looking back at it, the title almost fails to like make the joke that I wanted to make in that the town in Oklahoma, everyone pronounces it Prague, which I think is so ridiculous. I mean, it's a town founded by, Czech immigrants. So, of course, when it was founded, I'm sure it was pronounced the same way that the city in Europe would be pronounced, or in the Czech Republic. But I guess over time, people have just started butchering the name to pronounce it completely differently. And that made me start thinking about, is the idea of naming something as ceremonious as we think it is? Or is it really just, choosing what burden we're giving to people to deal with for the rest of their lives? My name's Tory. It's like, how many times in my life has that been butchered by someone when they're like reading it on paper? Or like coming to terms with the fact that the name on paper belongs to like a man, right? It's always interesting to see them struggle with that. And so I think with naming poems, it's also like this one in particular, you know, is it as ceremonious as I think it's going to be in giving this poem a title, or is it just going to be something that are more words for people to think about and maybe like not get the joke? But in this poem in particular, I think it's a good example of a lot of times I want my titles to, I guess, provide some sort of context or information or set the scene for the poem. And in this particular poem, there's a stanza about naming things and how sometimes we name things and um the naming goes askew. And so I wanted the context of that stanza to exist in the title because otherwise I don't know how else I would have fit it in naturally. um I think Cockroach Angel is a similar idea in where I wanted it to sort of like set up the juxtaposition that was going to be explored in the poem, with the title of like cockroach being compared to angel. Um, yeah, I find titles a lot of times to be sort of like, if you think of it in theater terms or in script writing, right, you have like that scene setting paragraph that gives you like the interior or the exterior of the setting, before you get into the meat of the dialogue or the action. And that's how I think a lot of times see titles, for me is like, what does the reader need to know that maybe I can't find a natural way to include in the poem itself?
Mhm. Also, I think when I am using epigraphs along with the title, how do I give the reader a little bit more help, particularly if I'm wading into some dense surrealist
Right.
ideas? And as someone who's a Jon, I can't tell you how many times people put the H in there. It's short for Jonathan. I'm named after Jonathan Livingston Seagull, the hippie bird of the 70s. But that H is my mortal enemy. And
Yeah, I
then
mean, it is sort of like you're choosing to name, whenever you choose to name a child, it's like, okay, what mistake do I want them to have to correct for their entire life, basically?
mhm,
And some people are lucky enough where like, I mean, Johns with the H probably don't experience,
they've got it lucky.
they've got it lucky, right? And so names are in that way, I think, a sort of burden. It's like, how much of a burden am I putting on my child? Maybe like I give them a little bit of a burden, but not too much. Maybe I give them a lot of a burden. I don't know.
Mm. And then I think being in front of a classroom, there's always the fact that do my students want them to call me John or just
Right.
by the last name? And or the email says Jonathan, but it's John as I've been my entire life. And then I always have to explain that my last name is pronounced. It's like reaching for Cheerios. So I do get some cold breakfast in there. But it used to be Riccio, and then my brother went to Italy and he came back and the C's became the ch as they are in Italian, but he brought back the short I still, but now more research is saying, okay, well, the I is actually long, so it's Riccio. And some family members still say Riccio. Some family members in upstate New York say Riccio, but I'm trying to be as authentic as possible here. And even the whole time in graduate school, am I a Jonathan as a poet or am I a John? And then how do you want to be seen online or in journals and writerly identity? And there have been times when my writerly identity has always been to that Jonathan, but as I've gotten older, it's just no, I'm reverting back to the John I've always been. Getting Somewhere is a poem of yours I read over my spring break or day 6 of tackling a checkoff list that included grading, syllabus planning, and lecture recording. But I also wrote more than I had in months, getting into 1 hour sessions, among others, definite somewhere moments. When I block revision time out as anybody's guess, though my goal is gathering as many insights as possible so that I shake up my process. What are some of your revision approaches?
Yeah, I think as a writer, revision is something that I've always, I don't want to say have been scared of, but like it's not a strength of mine. I think some people really excel in the revision process. And it's something that I do not feel like I've always excelled in. So I've really had to sort of like hone the process, right? And think about like what works for me. I think one approach that I found really helpful is sort of like being very strict about like what phase of revising or like what thing am I looking at in this sitting, I guess. And so like creating a phase of revision that's solely for rhythm or pacing. I'm not worried about what anything means. I'm not worried if this word is getting across the idea that I exactly want to get across. In this sitting, I am solely looking at how it sounds, how it flows, and what the rhythm is. And then after maybe that phase, rarely do I do any like multiple phases in one sitting. It's usually I take some breaks. But the next phase will be okay. This phase of revision is solely about meaning and making sure that like the ideas that are coming across, the images that are used, are all working in the way that they should. Because I find if I sit down with a poem and just say, okay, I need to revise this point blank period with no specific lens or focal point, that's really overwhelming to me. And it feels like there's just so much to do that I find it to be a lot of times really inefficient. So like, taking like baby bites at a time has been really helpful. I think one of the most common revision suggestions that people give is to, read your poems out loud and listen. I've found that I struggle listening and reading at the same time. So I'll a lot of times record myself on video reading poems and then I'll watch them back. And I think one, it allows me just to listen without having to think about reading. And I also think watching myself read on video, you can see when you're like struggling or like really having to focus at certain points in a poem to read it accurately. And I think being able to like look at myself struggling to read something is helpful to know like, okay, what areas may a reader also have struggles reading? What areas are maybe not flowing like I want them to flow? And so I think those are my two biggest I don't know, approaches that feel in any way unique to me. Although I'm sure they're not like everyone probably does those, but they feel like they are beyond just sort of the typical approaches.
I like the aspect of recording yourself. And when I was in grad school at University of Arizona, I had an internship at the Poetry Center digitizing their Voca, and it's pretty
Mm,
much all the recordings that have been made of visiting poets who've given readings there and fiction writers. It's since the late 1960s, and doing the metadata to have little clouds of what the subjects were that were covered. And the more that you, of course, hear the delivery style of poets, it helps you with your own articulation. And there's August Kleinsaller's recording that I remember just hearing his cadences, and he has quite a punchy delivery, but it just fit the style of the poems. And it did contribute to how I thought of myself as trying to get more articulate, trying to open my mouth when
right.
I read and not sort of just shrink into myself and not be in my little world of, oh, I'm finally at this microphone and sharing what I've worked on for weeks and months. But these poets who've been doing it for years and decades, it's like second nature to them. And I think that was
Right.
the greatest takeaway of having that internship and listening to dozens and dozens of reading styles, delivery styles.
Yeah, and it really hones in the idea of like, I think for poets, like it puts us in a position that feels a little uncomfortable, right? Because we want to write a poem and be able to like let the language speak for itself. But when you're in a public setting and you're having to read these things out loud, it's like the writing cannot speak for itself in that setting. Like you have to do work yourself. You can't just read the poem in any given approach and rely on what you've written to get across what you want to get across. There is a certain level of performance to it that I don't know. I don't find a lot of poets that I know to be naturally performative people. And so it's a muscle for sure that I think, especially in revision and watching myself read poems back, is like been strengthened. Hopefully a
Mhm.
little, maybe not quite to where I want it to be, but
For me, the most terrifying and vulnerable aspect of workshops, it was when the instructor would build it into the time allotted for us, where someone would read our poems
mm,
back to us. And we have it in our head of how we want it. We have our, yes, we punctuate the page, but we also have that internal punctuator. And everybody, just as there are different levels of McNugget loving and levels of ketchup and barbecue sauce. I will even say mustard because it is a condiment. But everyone has their internal punctuator and everyone reads work out loud differently. And it was just so interesting because you have it in a certain fixed mindset orally up here,
mhm.
and then it's completely out of your control when someone else is reading it. And then that just gives you the perspective of, well, how is an editor reading my work if they're just doing it in the head with their internal punctuator, or if they're even reading it out loud, how does that change it? And completely vulnerable feeling, but it was also one of the strongest takeaways that I got from my workshop years. And actually, if there are enough minutes for my students in the intro level workshops, especially, I have that as one of the built-in aspects where they're reading the poem and then someone reads it back to them.
Yeah, that's great. And it sort of also makes me think like for me, I think poetry, so much of it, especially like the things that go right, I often, it's been my experience that so much of it is by accident almost.
Mhm.
And even just not thinking about people reading the poem out loud, but just, in the process of workshop, of hearing people's interpretations of your work that weren't intentional at all, but that you sort of like accidentally included in a poem. Um, and like it's those moments of like surprise. It's like, oh, I didn't mean to do that, but that's great. And in the same way of like hearing someone read a poem out loud, it's like, oh, I didn't mean for them to read it this way, but I actually do really like that interpretation or that
Mhm.
cadence that they gave it. And it's like these little accidents that make you see your own work in, I think, a totally different way.
Mhm. There's actually time for getting somewhere, and the floor is all yours to read it.
Yeah. Getting somewhere. I got nowhere today, and I will get nowhere tomorrow. Sitting on a wet sofa, wet from I don't know what, I can feel time and space having intercourse. I am the sad voyeur in the corner, the ugly triplet, the odd one out at the threesome. The air is all rhythm and no standing. I look out the window and see the neighbor taking out his garbage. He puts the bag in the bin like a mother putting her baby in a crib. I remember childhood, not my own, but the meaning of the word. It sits heavy on my tongue, singing a song I am tired of hearing. I remember Robin Hood, too, but that feels like a different thing. When the Big Bang happened, I was in Oklahoma. There was a rodeo that day. A child won $100 by taking it from the tail of a muddy calf. There was a large boom as the child thrust his prize in the air. We all looked around and realized we were existing. There is only time and not time, space wearing a poncho and not space. In a room, I am the absence of money. The neighbor takes out another bag of garbage, and the television is game show heaven. Let there be a river. Let it be so at peace with itself, it takes my whole lifetime to meet the ocean. Any good river should be fat. Any good ocean should be worth meeting. That is philosophy. I may have gotten nowhere today, and I will probably get nowhere tomorrow. But when I do get somewhere, it'll be Napa Valley. The sun will be drooling fire, and I will be at a vineyard. A nearby villa hosts a birthday party, and although I was not invited, I don't mind because I have finally gotten somewhere. Somewhere so green it could be a salad bowl. Somewhere well mannered and dry, where leaves float to the ground in lazy parades and the babies sleep. The air will begin to pray, and I will listen. Blessed be the vineyard. Blessed be the vines. Blessed be the grape and the wet mouth that eats it.
Nice. We have Robin Hood, definitely not the Quaker Oats Quaker, and Mud Money. Napa Valley and your definition of philosophy. In contrast with your other lineated poems, and what's nice is we also will be posting this on the One Week Critique website so that folks can see the poem. So thank you again. And this was originally published, I believe, at Narrative Magazine. Okay.
Yes.
And when they see the poem, they'll actually be able to look at some of these lineated, the longer lineated lines. And for me, those longer lineations, they aid in the image making, such as that unbroken sentence, somewhere so green it could be a salad bowl. Space wearing a poncho and not space is another image I enjoy because it's a combination of fashion, physics, and impossibility. Since most cosmoses aren't clothes horses, what was the impulse that led to this poem while breaking from some of your more columnar-oriented pieces?
Yeah, I think a lot of my early writing was really dominated by prose poems, like the Quaker Oats Quaker. The Quaker Oats Quaker, I think, was the first poem that I ever had published. And it sort of represents that early work where I was really fixated on prose as a form, almost in a way in which I was like scared to use line breaks. And I think the two poems that I have just had published in the Fairy Tale Review, Cockroach Angel at the Piece of Peak Mountain, are my most recent poems and very indicative of what I'm writing now and very a lot shorter lines. So I think getting somewhere and also Letters to God both serve as sort of that middle ground of my sort of journey towards like really short lines. Um, and so I think that sort of represents the like my foray into breaking the line while still maintaining, I think, a lot of that prose structure. Because as my lines get shorter, I think my poems also get less narrative. Whereas Getting Somewhere, I think, is largely narrative in a way that isn't as narrative as the prose poems that I was writing, but certainly retains a lot of that element. And so the longer lines, like you said, really help to sort of corral the images, but also corral the narrative in a way that I find makes a lot more sense for those types of poems. I think the content of the poem was also very indicative of sort of where I was in my sort of writing journey. I think that poem was like a year after graduating from grad school. Um, I was kind of experiencing that like post grad school slump where it was like, am I going to write poems ever again, or am
Mhm.
I maybe done? And so like this idea of like, am I getting anywhere with this? Was this worth it? And using that poem and the sort of revival, not revival, the sort of renovation of how I write as maybe a jump start to getting back into the process of writing. So yeah, I think the like longer lines and sort of the introduction, at least to my work, of using line breaks was sort of that energy and motivation to like get back in the saddle of writing poems after that sort of burnout break of grad school. And I think this poem really represents that.
I'm also thinking you have some specific geographies in Getting Somewhere. Napa Valley, you have the rodeo, and that's a pretty expansive. You need to have the cattle doing their and the ropes and the clowns and the probably the 10-gallon hats. And I now understand how they live better in those more open spaces, whereas a mukbang or the Minister of Nutrition, those, if you put them in that more columnar, as they are in the Fairy Tale Review publications, the eye is drawn more to that. You will notice, and I actually had to look up the word mukbang when I first read your poem, and then it all made sense. And I think, oh yes, there could be a Minister of Nutrition, and I could see them in a smaller office, and they definitely are not out with lariats and trying to rope steers. More of an austere type of job they have, but maybe there's something to be said about the geography aspects and giving them more of those spaces, as we did see in this poem of yours. I prioritize close reading with students because it's a practice I played catch up with in grad school, though it does stay in your orbit once you have the skill. This poem rewards the close reader is a comment I often make when advocating for fairy tale review submissions, or when I provide feedback on especially engaging drafts. What poets and poems provided early close reading rewards for you?
Yeah, I think a really big influence for me was James Tate, um, and especially his early work before he got into like the really prosy poems of his sort of last couple of books. I found his approach to surrealism and especially images to be really educational for myself in how to use images in a poem. I think a really big recurring criticism that I got in school of my work was, oh, it feels like you're using images just for the sake of using images, and that they don't necessarily feel thought out or intentional. And so I really had to think, how can I still use these like surreal, sort of dreamlike images in a way that doesn't feel random or careless? And his work, and my favorite poem of his is The Wheelchair Butterfly. Um, that poem, I think I always think back to, and I've taught that poem a lot to my students, in how something that seems random can actually be contributing to an atmosphere in a poem. A lot of times I've given my students, with that poem at least, close reading exercises to go through and make a list of all the major images that you see, and then describe those images with other words. Give them defining adjectives. And that poem, I think, what I saw a lot with students is that they'll like make a list of images in that poem. There's the girl who is always pregnant. There are mentions of mice, an old piece of string, images like that, that they often sort of all describe as being delicate or gentle. And then they'll have a second column of words like car fare, suicide, broken bones, glass, that they often describe as something akin to dangerous. And asking them, when you were reading this poem, did you notice that there were all of these images that sort of fell within one of these two buckets of either being gentle or being dangerous? And they'll say, no, not when I was reading it. But after I did a close reading exercise, I noticed that they're all contributing towards this like atmosphere of um, danger and fragility, and the juxtaposition of those two things. And so, yeah, that's a really good example of a poet and a poem that really taught me how to use images with intention, and make sure that all of my images are contributing to what I always refer to as sort of like the atmosphere
Mhm.
of the poem.
In grad school, that's where obviously I had to write about poems, and that meant I had to dig deeper than I was used to. And probably the first poem where I had a close reading breakthrough would have been Frank O'Hara, A True Account of Talking to the Sun at Fire Island. And then I had a forms class where we had to write X amount of papers. And I just remember falling into the text of Patricia Smith's Blood Dazzler. And a lot of the stuff I talked about in my paper was the fact that you would have a sestina, you would have tankas in that work, you had the epigraphs, you had the Hurricane Katrina personified as a woman, and even Natalie Diaz, when my brother was an Aztec, I wrote a paper on that, and just the sheer amount of close reading and attention given. And I do owe my grad school teachers for instilling the value and the love of close reading. And now it's something I enjoy passing on. And even when I'm reading still out of grad school since 2020, but the learning keeps going on, and it's often annotating and starring or astericking,
Hmm.
and that's the joy that comes with poetry.
Yeah. And I agree. It's something that brings me a lot of joy as well, but it's also something that I was like so resistant to. I think inherently, admittedly, I'm admitting this to everyone who could potentially be watching this. I am an inherently lazy person. I think if something feels like work, then I tend to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, avoid it. And close reading for a long time felt like a lot of work to me. I think my relationship to poetry was I wanted to be able to read a poem and be struck by it without doing any work. You know, I wanted everything that exists in the poem to happen to me and just to experience it. And you don't realize it at the time, but all of like these experiences that you're wanting to have with poetry, you're missing out on by not
Mhm.
doing the close reading.
Mhm.
Because you have to find them. They're not just going to find you a lot of times.
Maybe it's a little grandiose, but I'm feel that way when especially when I teach stories. And early on, when I taught literary interpretation courses, I had a Norton anthology, one of those yay thick and yay wide. And of course, the pages are onion skin thin. And there was something to be said about me just standing up very much, I guess you could say, quasi preacher. Well, I was preaching on behalf of literature. And the little missalette like qualities of this gargantuan anthology and all of the marginalia, all of my scribbly pencil. And then it was show and tell where it's just you show them, here's exactly how I got to know this story to the level where I can get up and talk about it for a half hour if I need to. And if you want to see this document of how I became a closer reader of Kafka or a closer reader of Marquez or Charlotte Perkins' Gum in the Yellow Wallpaper or John Steinbeck's The Chrysanthemums. Here's a record of it. And it's a record I gladly pass along to you students and glean from it what you will. Of course, they're usually just, but I've got it on my laptop or I've got it just on the stories in the palm of my hand. But every now and then you get those students who are marking up and color coding and astericking and even interrobanging. And I'm just music to the eyes to have that process go on to the next generation of close readers. And I'm taken with the fact that there is a Prague, Oklahoma, and that the state's rodeos have some big bang tethering. I knew an oboist who played in the Tulsa Symphony Orchestra, and I proudly have my Golden Girls aura on today because, as any Golden Girls fan will tell you, who watched that lifetime intimate portrait of Rue McClanahan, that she was from Hieldson, Oklahoma. There's an Enid. And then the word Okla hermeneutics just popped into my head. Maybe you could elaborate on that and also tell us how else does being an Oklahoman contribute to your poetry?
Yeah. Um, I don't know what to think about the word Oklahomaneutics. I feel like I'm going to have to think about that for the rest of the day. But in terms of being from Oklahoma, it's, I think, taken me a long time to, as I'm sure is the case with a lot of people, to view where I'm from as being worth thinking about, right? Because once you leave where you're from, you sort of just want to like put it in the past. You want to stop thinking about it. And I think somewhere like Oklahoma, especially, where historically it's just like so full of like terror almost, with like the abuse and displacement of Native people, Tulsa race riots, the sort of like ongoing criminal behavior of like oil men, and even currently politically, economically, educationally, people wouldn't describe it as like a thriving state. And so for so much of my life, I've just seen it as this really bleak place. And I think I still see it as a pretty bleak setting. But over time, I've sort of acknowledged like the almost like oasis in a desert quality of the state in which like, yeah, a lot of it is really bleak, but there are these pockets of really astounding and inspirational artistic happenings. You know, you mentioned the Tulsa Symphony Orchestra. Thinking about the rodeo, International Gay Rodeo Association has like a pretty large presence in Oklahoma. There are some really amazing poetic voices from Oklahoma. I believe Joy Harjo was born there.
Mhm.
Some of my favorites, like Joe Brainerd, Ted Berrigan, Ron Padgett, like the three of them, all
Mhm.
were either born there or spent time there, were raised there in some way. And so, and I think thinking about surrealism specifically, you used Marquez as an example, and that is a great example of like a lot of his settings are the bleakest settings you can sort of imagine, but they're filled with all this, magical, surreal imagery and plot devices. And I think that's so important because for surrealism to really work and to really blossom, I think it needs a lot of times to be set in the most real place that you can imagine. And I don't think there's anything much more real than somewhere that almost feels desolate, that economically feels full of strife, that feels really hostile to a lot of communities. I
Mhm.
think that's about as real as you can get. And so using that setting, or at the very least, that inspiration to create something surreal or magical, I think is the most effective way to do it, in my opinion. You know, because if you think of something or a place or a setting that's sort of already somewhat surreal, like big thriving cities like New York City, like so much that's happening there already almost feels surreal. So if you use that as sort of a setting or an inspiration for surrealism, I think that takes away from some of the surreal elements. And so Oklahoma over time has really sort of instilled in me like that sort of dynamic of yes, like a place can be really hostile and bleak, but there can exist like these pockets of magic or pockets
Mhm.
of surrealism there.
Mhm.
And it almost like takes those pockets to like a whole nother level of
Mhm.
inspiration or effectiveness.
Yeah, and I just wrote down Joe Brainerd, Ron Padgett, and that brings me back to reading I Remember for graduate school in my MFA and then writing a paper on it in the PhD years. And of course, I would name the paper Stranger Flings because of all of the actions that go on that Joe Brainerd is remembering. And that also makes me think about Ron Padgett as poet, but also Ron Padgett, who knew Joe Brainerd, to
Mhm.
use the cliche, way back when, but he is now one of those people who he brings forth, he's the torch carrier of the unofficial, I guess you could say, spokesperson for the Joe Brainerd Word Museum because due to their friendship and Joe Brainerd's early passing.
Yeah, absolutely. I love I Remember, and I think reading it, I think I also read it in grad school and being able, I Oklahoma is not somewhere that I felt like I often saw represented in any way. And so like reading that and seeing so many experiences that felt so personal to me and so similar to my own upbringing, I think almost like inspired me to use Oklahoma and my childhood and the way that I was raised in a more like spring-like way in which there are things here that are just like ripe for the picking, um,
Mhm.
and like so full of impact and inspiration for my work.
Mhm.
And I remember, I think, was a big example of doing that.
It's so rich with the anaphora, and it is prose.
Right. But it doesn't always feel like it, I think,
Hmm.
especially in like those really more surreal, wild experiences. It's like, oh, how is this prose? This feels like a fever dream of like poetry that he's just coming up with.
Hmm. And then he even had an artist phase too. So
Mhm.
there's so many sides of Joe Brainerd. Thank you again for your poems, Tori. These pieces give me a much appreciated window into your creativity. I'm sure viewers will likewise think of what their work can do in that quadrant of food, religion, commerce, and home states. What are your current poetry undertakings?
Yeah, I think The bio at the beginning mentioned it. I'm really trying to focus on like my first full book of poems, tweaking that, making last minute additions, subtractions, all the chaos that comes with that. And so yeah, I'm really trying to just focus on that as much as I can in between teaching and work and things like that.
Hmm. And you're teaching, what subjects are you doing for your school?
Yeah, I teach a lot of sort of basic composition
Mhm.
courses, business writing, and then sprinkled in here as a little treat, they give me some creative writing classes
Good,
to keep me on my toes. But
good. You like to share another poem with us?
yeah, absolutely. I actually think I would like to read maybe a work in progress, if that
Okay, of
works.
course.
Yeah. All right. This is titled After the River Stopped Flowing. It is terrible how the burbling wharf bangs its teeth into every brotherly ship, how the woodchuck bulkhead of the introspective librarian juts its thumb into our eerie direction. Whatever happened to being gentle? Whatever happened to kissing the belly like my mind kisses the Disneyland? Barely and every so often. The slug-like polka player may, for once in his life, regard his accordion as a vintage instrument and not as a weapon against peace. What is this country if not wanting to slumber? What is this restaurant with its endless ambiance and perfect sauces if not Shangri-La? When the river flows again, I will follow it like a dog follows the garbage to the Singaporean internet master to receive his childlike umbrage against the palp of the government. I'll take his cup and drink from the river, and I will see in my mind's goggle the complete and gorgeous utopia of loving our wives, the pristine and inertial slosh of the planet's newfound empathy, the gargantuan bargain of trading militaries for the disco, a future so idyllic and dripping in honey even the boulders will sing. Even the monks in all their bald silence will lift up their fastidious arms and welcome each morning as a miraculously gilded newborn. And as for my place in this purple future, in this gleaming and metallic supermarket brimming with mercy, in this personal yet internationally accurate vision of knitwear for pets and believing in ourselves, I will be in the back of the supermarket, stocking the shelves. One can is labeled as a medley of legumes, another as radiant peaches in a golden and loving syrup, and one as all the eventual swimming pools we will swim in together.
Great. Wow, Tori. I was listening and writing Purple Futures. Take me there. I want to be in that future. And the mind's goggle, the inertial slush. Even hearing you have sh the inertial and the slush, there's such a beauty of language here at the letter level that's happening. You begin with burbling wharf, and the fact that we have that harder G and those two B's that they're not exactly soft letters, but they're not the type of bludgeon you over the head letter. But you have the F in wharf that softens it up, and in the South, the whole could it be wharf or wharf? I mean, and you have the slug-like polka player, so the alliteration and the hard K, that hard G in slug, but and that hard K in like, but then the S and the L that we're softening it up, and we had some of that those anaphora moves. What is this? And that if not components, and the Singaporean internet master. Hmm, that, you know what? I am just wondering what would happen if the Singaporean internet master met up with the snack cake temptress. Hmm.
Unspeakable stuff, probably.
Oh, can you talk about the mukbang that would be?
Yeah, part of me choosing to read this one was for the endless sauces or the perfect
Well,
sauce.
thank you. I'm honored, right? And so are all the people who dip everywhere. We're out there. If not the McNuggets, then the French fries. If not the French fries, and I can never get the word for what the Canadians, they're poutine, right? That
With
that is a
the
form of dipping.
like the gravy and the cheese and the
Mhm. Or the common rite of passage for everyone in college, your first plate of hummus and pita. I swear, as soon as you're 17 or 18, the hummus world opens up for you, the pita opens up for
Right.
you. You
Yeah, I
forget.
mean, your parents aren't giving you hummus growing up. It's like you have to enter the world fully before you can even be let in on the secret that hummus
Mhm.
exists.
Yes, that is so true. Well, thank you again, and best of luck for your collection. And it was so good to hear all these insights. Wonderful, Tori. I appreciate it, and hope you have a great end of your semester.
Thank you so much. Yes, thanks for having me. This has been amazing.
Sure.